In 1850, a farming family could preserve large quantities of meat without a freezer, without electricity, and without a monthly power bill. Cuts of beef could hang for months. Mutton could be cured and smoked. Goat meat could be salted, dried, and preserved. In different parts of the world, families developed their own versions of the same basic idea: salt, smoke, drying, time. Today, most of us preserve that same food by opening a freezer door and putting it inside. And there is nothing wrong with that. A freezer is fast, it's convenient, it's predictable. But there's one thing the old smokehouse had that your freezer doesn't. It didn't need the grid. So why did generations of people rely on curing, smoking, and drying? And what did they understand about preserving food that most of us no longer need to think about? Because the interesting part isn't that the old way was always better. It's that some knowledge became unnecessary long before it became useless. And that's knowledge worth keeping. Here's the reality of the freezer sitting in your kitchen. It is remarkably good at what it does. At temperatures around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing dramatically slows the biological and chemical processes that cause food to deteriorate. Properly frozen food can remain safe for very long periods, although quality can gradually decline. But the freezer has one fundamental requirement: electricity. Take that away, and the clock begins running. Not quite as quickly as people sometimes imagine. An unopened full freezer can usually maintain a safe temperature for roughly 2 days. A half-full freezer may hold it for about a day. That's considerably better than 4 hours. But the principle remains the same. The freezer is not preserving food independently. It is maintaining an environment that preserves the food, and that environment depends on continuous energy. For most of us, that's a perfectly reasonable trade. But for most of human history, people didn't have that option. They needed preservation methods that changed the food itself. And that's where curing, smoking, and drying become interesting. This isn't folklore. There's real chemistry behind it. Traditional meat preservation worked by attacking one of the things microorganisms need most: available moisture. Bacteria may be incredibly resilient, but they cannot multiply freely without enough accessible water. Salt helps change that environment. When meat is properly cured, salt draws moisture from the tissue and changes the conditions available to microorganisms. But salt is only one part of the story. Smoke contains compounds that contribute flavor, color, and some antimicrobial effects at the surface. And then there's drying. As properly cured meat gradually loses additional moisture under controlled conditions, the environment becomes increasingly difficult for spoilage organisms to exploit. Salt, controlled smoking, drying, time, and, importantly, the right temperatures and conditions throughout the process. That combination allowed certain traditionally cured meats to remain stable for periods that would seem extraordinary to someone accustomed to relying entirely on refrigeration. Properly cured and dried beef or mutton, for example, could remain usable for extended periods when processed and stored under the right conditions. But there's an important distinction here. Putting raw meat over smoke does not magically make it safe for months. Ordinary barbecue is not the same thing as traditional preservation. A piece of meat can be smoked for flavor and still require refrigeration. The traditional methods that produced shelf-stable foods were complete preservation systems. And that distinction matters. Our ancestors may not have known terms like water activity or microbial inhibition. They may not have understood the chemistry in the way a food scientist does today. What they had was accumulated experience. Generation after generation discovered that certain combinations worked. Others didn't. And when food preservation meant the difference between eating through winter and running out of food, people had a powerful reason to remember which was which. So how did this work in practice? Imagine a smokehouse. Nothing particularly sophisticated. In many places, it was simply a small enclosed structure with enough height to suspend meat well away from the fire and enough ventilation to allow smoke to move slowly through the building. The exact design varied enormously. Different climates developed different methods. Different cultures used different woods, cuts, seasonings, and curing techniques. But in many traditional systems, one principle remained remarkably consistent. The preservation process began before the smoke. Fresh meat would first be cured. Salt was applied according to the method being used, sometimes together with sugar, nitrates, or other curing ingredients. And then something happened that modern convenience allows us to ignore. They waited. The cure needed time to work. That matters because preservation isn't simply about coating the outside of a piece of meat. The process has to reach the areas that need protection. Large cuts require considerably more care than thin pieces. Temperature matters. The amount of cure matters. The size and shape of the meat matter. This is why traditional curing developed into a craft rather than a trick. Once properly cured, some meats would then be smoked. And here again, we're not necessarily talking about the kind of smoking most people picture today. Modern barbecue is often about cooking meat while adding smoke flavor. Traditional preservation smoking could involve very different combinations of temperature, duration, curing, and subsequent drying. The meat wasn't simply thrown above a roaring fire. The smoke had to be controlled, the fire had to be managed, and the meat had to be positioned appropriately. Wood choice mattered too. Hardwoods such as hickory and oak became strongly associated with smoking in parts of North America. Fruit woods such as apple were also valued for their milder character. Resinous woods such as pine were generally poor choices because they can produce unpleasant flavors and deposits. But the smoke was never the entire system. That's probably the most important thing to understand. The cure was doing critical preservation work. Drying was doing critical preservation work. Temperature and time were doing critical preservation work. Smoke contributed to the process while also creating the flavor we now associate with traditional smoked foods. And across different parts of the world, people adapted the basic principles to whatever animals and environmental conditions they had available. In places where cattle were common, families preserved beef through salting, drying, and smoking. Where sheep were more important, communities developed preserved forms of lamb and mutton. In regions where goats were widely kept, goat meat could also be salted, dried, or smoked for longer storage. Other communities developed their own methods using the livestock available to them. Different animals, different cuts, different climates, slightly different timing, but the same underlying problem. How do you preserve valuable food when there's no refrigerator waiting in the kitchen? For many communities, curing, drying, and smoking were part of the answer, not the only answer. People also fermented food. They dried it in the sun. They pickled it. They stored food underground. They used cold climates and natural ice. They preserved meat using other traditional techniques suited to their environment. Human beings developed an extraordinary number of ways to solve the same problem, and that's exactly what makes this history so useful. It isn't about discovering one magical old technique. It's about realizing how much practical knowledge people accumulated because they had no alternative. For many farming families, the annual slaughter wasn't simply a meal, it was an event. A large amount of food suddenly had to be processed correctly. There was no freezer large enough to absorb everything. There might not have been a freezer at all. So preservation was planned. Some meat was eaten fresh, some was salted, some was cured. Some was smoked, some was dried. Different cuts went toward different purposes. A family's food supply could depend on getting those decisions right. And that's what modern refrigeration changed. It didn't make traditional preservation stop working. It made much of the knowledge unnecessary for ordinary households. That's an important difference. When mechanical refrigeration became widespread, people gained something enormously valuable: convenience. You no longer needed to plan an entire preservation cycle every time an animal was slaughtered. You didn't need generations of curing experience simply to keep meat available. You could cool it, freeze it, package it, buy it when needed. That was genuine progress. But every technology involves a trade. The freezer gave us convenience and consistency. the older methods offered something else: independence from continuous electricity. So let's compare them fairly. The freezer wins on convenience. Put properly packaged meat inside, maintain the temperature, and your work is largely finished. It also gives you enormous flexibility. Beef, lamb, mutton, goat fish, vegetables, leftovers, one appliance can preserve an astonishing variety of food with relatively little skill required from the person using it. That's difficult to beat. But the freezer consumes electricity continuously, and when that electricity disappears long enough, eventually the protection disappears with it. Traditional curing and drying work differently. Instead of continuously maintaining the food in an artificial cold environment, certain preservation methods physically and chemically change the food so that it can tolerate storage conditions that fresh meat cannot. That can make properly prepared shelf-stable foods far more resilient to electricity interruptions. But there is a cost: time, knowledge, control, patience, and food safety discipline. Proper curing may take days or weeks. Drying and aging may take much longer. Not every smoked product is shelf-stable. Not every environment is suitable. And improvising with curing ingredients or temperatures can be dangerous. So should you throw out your freezer and build a smokehouse? No, that misses the point completely. The freezer and the traditional smokehouse solve the same problem in different ways. One uses energy and convenience. The other relies much more heavily on process and knowledge. For everyday life, the freezer is extraordinarily useful. But if you're interested in self-reliance, food preservation, traditional skills, emergency preparedness, culinary history, or simply understanding how people solved everyday problems before modern technology, then these older methods still have something to teach us. And that's why this matters today. We're living in a world where convenience often hides the systems supporting it. Turn on a tap, and water appears. Flip a switch, and the lights come on. Open a supermarket, and food is waiting. Open a freezer, and last month's meat is still there. Most of the time, that's wonderful. But convenience can also separate us from understanding how things actually work. Earlier generations didn't necessarily possess superior technology. They possessed knowledge adapted to a world with fewer technological safety nets. And some of that knowledge remains useful. Learning why salt preserves food teaches you chemistry. Learning why meat must lose moisture teaches you microbiology. Learning why temperature matters teaches you food safety. Learning how different cultures preserved food teaches you history. And learning how people solved problems with the resources available to them teaches something even bigger: adaptability. That's the real lesson here. The smokehouse isn't interesting simply because it's old. It's interesting because it represents a different way of solving a problem we still have today. How do we make food last? Today, our first answer is usually electricity. 200 years ago, the answer was often knowledge. Salt, smoke, drying, time. Neither era has a monopoly on good ideas. And preserving traditional knowledge doesn't mean rejecting modern technology. You can own a freezer and still understand curing. You can use electricity and still understand how people lived without it. You can appreciate modern food safety while studying the methods that eventually helped us understand preservation in the first place. In fact, that's probably the smartest approach. Keep the convenience. Recover the knowledge. Because the point isn't that the old way was always better. It wasn't. The point is that some knowledge became obsolete before it became useless. And when useful knowledge disappears simply because technology made it unnecessary, we lose more than an old technique. We lose another way of understanding how the world works. The freezer feels modern because it is. And for everyday food storage, it's difficult to beat. But the old smokehouse reminds us of something worth remembering. Technology can replace the need for a skill without replacing the value of understanding it. And that is knowledge worth keeping.